On January 19th, FNN had the privilege of visiting the African American Civil War Museum to clear up 5 misconceptions about black soldiers and their participation in the Civil War. Historic interpreter Marquett Milton walked us back in time to shed some light on our lost history.
Now, the Capital of the Confederacy, when I explained the Army of James, they become the 25th Army Corps in 1865. Robert E. Lee withdrew from Richmond on April 2nd, 1865. The next day, the 25th Army Corps, we're looking at about at least 30,000 colored troops, were the first into the capital of the Confederacy. So it was a big hit news. Richmond fall, captured by the black troops. They were continuing pressing Lee, and they forced Robert Lee to surrender the Appomattox. D.C. were the first to free their enslaved before anybody else in the South. It's called the D.C. Emancipation Act, which is April 16, 1862. So this is before the Emancipation Proclamation. About 3,300 African Americans were freed in the D.C. Emancipation Act, and many of them stayed at a place called Camp Barker, which historically was 2 blocks from here, which is today Garrison Elementary, between S Street and R Street. The camp didn't last no more than 2 years, but what they did was build a community along the U Street area. So by 1920, it was known as Black Broadway. Showing you this here. This talks about Reconstruction. Now, I'm not a full expert in it, but I can just explain, of my understanding of Reconstruction. But as you see, men of African descent served in office. They were in office between 1870 up to 1890. Senators, governors. This right here is a guy named P.B. Pinchback. He's actually, he was a color officer in the 2nd Louisiana Native Guard. So he identified himself as African descent, so he's a color officer. He's the first governor. Now, he ended up living here on U Street, on 13th and U. So the house is no longer there. He ended up living here on U Street. So Africans conquered certain places in Europe, like Spain, Italy, they all over Germany, Switzerland. You can find in the coats of arms. When they were kicked out, instead of back into West Africa, they migrated. Their descendants been in various wars. So in the 3 last centuries, a lot of them were captives and brought to the Americas. But they had different backgrounds, men and women, Muslims, Christians, different backgrounds. You can see it online. It's all on Google now. Most are Africans, some Arabs. But I also want to show you this right here. This right here is a young man. They say he looked similar to a Fulani warrior. You notice he has locks. So locks is a style that's been around for centuries. A lot of the, I can't speak for all, but there were many West African captives that came up with locks. So this guy right here is Benjamin O. Davis. He's the first African American general. He's from Washington, D.C. He attended M Street High School, which is Dunbar High School today. His son later is the commander of Tuskegee Airmen. So his name is Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Now, during the First World War, they would have European soldiers were told not to train African American troops, but the French would take African Americans in, and they would earn many medals for the French. Now, there's also at the same time Woodrow Wilson will ban African Americans out of the Navy. President Woodrow Wilson will bring prejudice heavily into the military, and in fact, African Americans will come back into the Navy into like 1930. So in World War II, only job they were assigned was cooks and stewards. That's about it. But African Americans, they did well in the First World War. Many of them came home, but when they returned home, there's a lot of racist prejudice was against when they came home. And this also showing that African Americans served in the Second World War. So African Americans continue on in the service. I do want to end by saying this. If you study the Civil War, like I said, there were people all over the world came here and fought in this rebellion. So the 200,000 men of African descent, they fought their way through freedom, ending slavery. You have these 1,500 Hispanics that volunteered. There's Native Americans involved. Some of them identify themselves as Black Indians. You have European descent and African descent, which are Canadians that came down. There's recorded large numbers of people from the British West Indies that volunteer, Central America and South America. We will have Hawaiians that volunteer, some of them fought in the 31st Colored Infantry Regiment. There were Asians that volunteered. We know there were 58 Chinese, and there were large numbers of Europeans that came over. And a lot of times